So we were thinking about what to call the game, and of course there's a big period where you try different names to give the right name to your product. And because this product needed to have, a land war, air war, and ground war, we decided for combined arms in the end, because we think that that term in military parlance obviously refers to the coordination of land forces, your troops, your tanks, with your airplanes, with your warplanes, with your ships. And so that the idea is for a successful military campaign, you need to have all three elements working together, coordinating to achieve victory, to take the objectives. So we thought, combined arms was going to be the title. So what's the difference between designing a board game and designing a war game? Well, it's quite different. A board game is kind of a self-contained environment where you have the advantage of having precise, like a grid. Often is the difference. You get hexes or squares, so everything can be a bit more precise, a bit more limited, a bit more finite. While a war game is far more free form. There's a lot of there's a lot of physicality. There's a lot of custom building. So the components you're working with, you're never quite sure what people will have in their hands on the table. Or in a board game, you know that because it's in the box. So there's a big difference in one environment is more free, less precise, the war game, or the board game is a bit more precise and more kind of final and limited.
So there are a lot of similarities in designing a sort of tabletop board game versus a strategic board game. Obviously, in this case, the theming is very similar. But the main differences are in the fact that you don't really know what the players are playing with when you're designing a war game. You might provide models and rules, and but there's this tradition of the hobby of conversion of house rules, and you get a much more sort of loose space in the wargaming world, whereas in sort of board games, even ones that are essentially war games like Command and Colours or something like that, it's much tighter, and you expect the players to be playing the thing that you design. So in a war game, you're sort of more open to say, oh, make a ruling. In this case, line of sight. Well, you guys work it out. Whereas in a board game, you need pretty hard rules for line of sight when things are in sort of view and when things are not in view. So that's the sort of the main difference between the two disciplines, I guess.
This could be controversial. Well, the thing I had in my head here was a very old game that I really enjoyed called Mighty Empires, where you had kind of a map and a lot of units, a lot of armies that moved on the board. It was like a board game. But then when these armies met, you actually could then resolve the fight either with a simple dice roll using the board game rules, or with the war game. You played a war game, and every army meant a certain number of troops, and you could play a Warhammer game in this case to resolve that fight, that battle, and then the campaign continued. So I really enjoyed that game. So in this case, I was going for something like that, where your armies represent a certain amount of troops in a war game.
The opening brief for Combined Arms was to create a game that would function as a standalone board game, but would also function as a way of playing campaign games, of stringing together and adding sort of narrative to various bolt action, Cruel Seas, Victory at Sea, or Cruel Seas or Victory at Sea, and Blood Red Skies games, and sort of winning in one game ties to the sort of your chances of winning in the others. But it did have to work as a standalone board game. The way we achieved this is by really sort of from the beginning making sure that every component that we added to a battle or sort of resolution in the board game was modular. So when you do a land battle, you are both rolling a die and you're getting modifiers, and there are cards that can affect those modifiers. And it's a fairly simple mechanic. And that whole mechanic is sort of, as we were designing it, sort of cordoned off. So there's a certain number of cards that affect those dice rolls, and if you are playing with bolt action, you take those cards out of the game, you put them back in the box, and you take different cards that change out how that works. So, for example, a card might say +2 to a dice roll because you've got forward artillery that's helping you out with the this particular battle. Whereas the same card for the campaign would say, in this battle of bolt action, you can use a forward artillery observer. The 4 maps that ended up in the box were, I believe, the Eastern Front, Northern Europe, Pacific, and North Africa, which I think are fairly iconic theatres of the war. Originally, we had various maps that were abstract designed, that were made to basically, you could put them together, but it always sort of felt like where you could put a Pacific map next to a European map, and that feels rather strange. And the decision was made to actually tie them to the sort of the physical locations and sort of tie it down to actual regions, so that the player would have more of a, oh, I've just pushed into this country or that country, I've just taken Malta. So basically that added to a lot of players' sort of connection to the game.
Right, so the 4 maps that ended up in the final version are what we thought were kind of like representative of 4 typical, Western Front, Eastern Front, Pacific, and Africa. So kind of 4 sectors of the war. Initially, we started with generic maps, and then eventually we felt that specific maps of real regions of Earth felt more historical. But of course, people could make up maps. Maybe we'll produce more maps to put on the web store and the website, and I'm sure that can be expanded.
Using real-world maps rather than creating our own sort of abstract game maps did have its challenges. One of those was the fact that when you're designing a game map, you can artificially go, oh, I'd like some land here because that'll create a choke point, or I want to create an island that's this shape because it'll be interesting for this bay to be here, so that you can get your ships in and they can give support to various units. When you're working with a real map, of course, your options there are limited. You can maybe say, oh, this landmass was significant, and therefore we're going to sort of treat it as a bit, we're going to sort of maybe expand it or treat it as more important than it looks physically on a map. But you can't create new islands, and you can't say the stuff's there that isn't there. So when we were designing the maps, we had to basically pick regions and starting hexes and things that made sure that every both sides basically had a bit of land, a bit of sea, or rather, they needed sea was the main thing, because you can't have an entirely land force, because then you've got no place to put your ships. And then from there, making sure that the maps chosen had the right amount of land, an interesting sort of physical space to basically create choke points or to travel faster across the sea. So it was more about choosing the right place and then tweaking the edges than creating out of whole cloth. The way you win combined arms is by capturing and then holding objectives. At a certain point during each round, the objectives come up in the card deck, and if you're holding the objective at that point, you get a victory point. So capturing them as soon as possible and holding them until they're worth that victory point is how you win the game. On top of that, they're also useful to hold because of their sort of special powers and abilities that they give you. So the airfield might give you a bonus in the air, and the fortifications are harder to take by the enemy. The cultural centre is worth 2 victory points rather than 1. They all have these little bonuses that add a bit of flavour to the map and to the game that you're playing, making sure that everything's always a little bit different. When you start a game of Combined Arms, you have a fairly massive decision to make of whether you're going to play it as a board game or whether you're going to use it as a campaign for either Bolt Action, Cruel Seas, Victory at Sea, or Blood Red Skies, or mix and match. So you could do Blood Red Skies and Bolt Action, but you don't own Cruel Seas or Victory at Sea, so you decide to sort of skip that one for now. And the main difference that makes in the game is that you will do your battles with those games rather than a simple die roll. And at the start of the game, you will take the cards sort of related to those dice rolls out of the game and replace them with initiative cards, which is basically the action cards in the game that pertain to those battles. Some of these, most of these, in fact, link into the games themselves. So you might have an artillery observer who adds sort of gives you a free forward observer. You might get, so there are planes in Victory at Sea, so you can use your sort of your air force that you're using in your Blood Red Skies battles, and there's sort of a bit of a conversion there into Victory at Sea with a certain card. And you can also, when certain planes and ships have experience levels in Victory at Sea and at Blood Red Skies, so there are cards that basically allow you to, when your plane is downed or when your ship is sunk, you can sort of retain the experience of that crew and put it onto a different plane or a different ship, and that sort of lets you have this feeling of continuation throughout the game. It's like, oh, this is the same guy that was in the Spitfire is in this different Spitfire, whereas otherwise he died, and that was sort of the end of his story. So it sort of helps create a little bit of a sort of connective tissue between the narratives. So when playtesting Combined Arms, we were quite careful to try and strike a balance between lots and lots of battles and games, and not enough, because at the end of the day, if you're fighting a battle over every sort of inch of ground, then you're never going to finish it. You're going to play, you probably play a game of Bolt Action once a week, and we don't want this to be the sort of game that takes 3 years to finish. So in a game where you're using sort of one of the sections, it's a very rough estimate, and it can be a bit more, it can be a bit less, and you can always decide when a game is completely sort of overrun, definitely going to lose, that we're not going to play this one because it's not a super interesting skirmish. We imagine that essentially it works out to about a battle per victory point, so one of each usually. So you'll have a battle of Bolt Action, a battle of Cruel Seas, and a battle of Blood Red Skies for each victory point, essentially. So in a 10 point game, that equates to around 10 games of, and if you were using all three, that'd be 10 games of each, which would be absolutely huge. I look forward to seeing people actually taking on the full all three games lumped into one.
At Riverhouse, we really enjoyed designing this game for Warlock Games, and likewise we hope you will enjoy playing it. Whether you decide to play it as a board game, as a self-standing board game, or whether you decide to engage it in the campaign system and bring your war games with it, I'm sure you'll have fun either way. And we would love to see what you're doing with it. Let us know about your games, about your maps, about your battles. It'd be great to know, because it will help us also decide where to take the game and in development terms. We can create new maps, campaigns, who knows. But just please get in touch. Let us know how you enjoy Combined Arms. Thank you very much.